Sarah Price was an unassuming young woman who had always loved the outdoors. At 27 years old, she had carved out a life in the small town of Crestwood, nestled between the Cascade Mountains, working as a park ranger for the national park. Sarah's heart belonged to the wilds. She had always felt more at home in the deep forests and rugged terrain of the Cascades than in any house or city. Her love for the wilderness started at a young age, fostered by the weekends spent hiking with her father. Those memories stayed with her, shaping her into the passionate protector of the land she had become. She wasn't just any ranger. Sarah was a dedicated environmentalist, an expert in local wildlife, with a deep knowledge of the flora and fauna of the Cascade Range. Her family and friends admired her for her courage, her unshakable determination, and her quiet, yet unwavering passion for the world around her. On the morning of her disappearance, Sarah was preparing for a solo hiking trip into the remote regions of the Cascades, far beyond the familiar park trails. It wasn't uncommon for her to disappear into the wild for days on end, documenting her findings, taking notes, and simply observing the untouched corners of the world she loved so much. The planned trip was to be a quiet escape, one that would allow her to capture detailed notes on the migratory patterns of elk she had been studying. She had packed her gear the night before, ensuring everything was in place: a compass, a portable stove, extra food, a first aid kit, and, of course, her camera and journal. The weather was clear, the forecast called for sun, and Sarah was in good spirits. She kissed her boyfriend, Jack, goodbye at the trailhead, reminding him of her expected return time, and that she would check in once she reached the halfway point. They had been dating for 2 years, though their relationship had never been overwhelming. They shared a simple understanding. Jack loved his work as a contractor and didn't mind the space Sarah often needed. He respected her solitude, even if it left him at home alone, waiting for her return. Sarah set off just before dawn, her sturdy boots crunching against the forest floor as she made her way through the trail. The dense woods enveloped her like a blanket, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The beauty of the forest was calming, and she took it all in, relishing in the peace it brought her. A few hours into her hike, she stopped to rest by a small creek. She took a deep breath, the smell of pine needles and fresh water filling her senses, and jotted down a few notes in her journal. She marveled at the way the sunlight danced on the water, casting flickering shadows along the stones. It was moments like these that reminded her of why she became a ranger: to protect these places, to preserve their quiet beauty for future generations. After a short break, she continued along the trail, moving deeper into the forest. The trail was familiar, but this particular stretch of it was more isolated, and Sarah enjoyed that. She had always preferred to work in solitude, away from the crowds that occasionally visited the park. The silence of the deeper woods gave her a sense of purpose, as if the very trees were watching over her. As she hiked further, she felt a slight unease tugging at her, but it was nothing unusual. The forest had its moods, and sometimes the stillness could feel overwhelming. She shrugged it off, attributing it to the natural isolation she felt on these extended hikes. She had been through this territory many times before, and the beauty of the land always outweighed the occasional feeling of unease. By midday, Sarah had reached the first of her planned campsites, a small clearing nestled at the base of a towering ridge. She took a moment to set up her tent, and as she did, she glanced around, admiring the landscape. The view from the clearing was breathtaking, a sweeping vista of deep green valleys and jagged peaks that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. It was the kind of beauty that made Sarah feel both incredibly small and incredibly powerful at the same time. After setting up, she checked in with Jack, sending him a quick message to let him know she had made it to the campsite and was about to go for a short hike to document some wildlife. She promised to check in again before dusk. It was routine for her, a habit she had built into every hike, to keep Jack at ease. The signal was spotty in the deep wilderness, but she always managed to send a quick update when she could. She set off once again, this time leaving the campsite behind. The goal was to find a herd of elk that had been spotted in the area recently. Sarah knew the chances of spotting them were slim, but she relished the hunt for knowledge. Her footsteps were steady, her body accustomed to the long miles she had hiked over the years. The afternoon passed slowly, the air growing warmer as the sun climbed higher in the sky. But by late afternoon, the light began to shift, and Sarah decided it was time to turn back to camp. She had hoped to spot the elk, but it seemed that they were nowhere to be found. As she made her way back to the clearing, Sarah's mind began to wander. She thought about Jack, about the home they shared, and the quiet life they had built together. She imagined the meal they would share that evening, the conversation that would flow easily as it always did. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a message from Jack. "Be safe. I'll be here waiting. Love you." She smiled, touched by his simple words. She quickly typed a reply. "I'll be back soon. Love you too." As she put her phone back in her pocket, she heard a noise from the brush. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it caught her attention. It was the sound of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush, just beyond her line of sight. Sarah froze, listening carefully. The wind had died down, and the forest was unusually quiet. The noise had stopped. She stood still for several moments, watching the area where the sound had come from, but nothing moved. After a few moments, Sarah shrugged it off, figuring it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks on her. She turned back toward the clearing, eager to set up camp and relax. But she never made it. The next morning, Jack grew concerned when Sarah hadn't checked in as promised. He called her phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in as he tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she had decided to stay an extra night. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. He reached out to the park authorities, and soon a search operation was underway. Days passed with no sign of Sarah. The weather turned, and the search expanded, with helicopters, search teams, and dogs scouring the area. But it was as if Sarah had vanished into thin air. Her car remained parked at the trailhead, her belongings untouched at the campsite. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just an eerie absence that seemed to stretch on forever. Jack couldn't understand it. There was no explanation, no trail to follow, no leads to pursue. Just silence. Her disappearance haunted the town of Crestwood. It wasn't the first time someone had gone missing in the mountains, but it was the first time in years that anyone had vanished without a trace. The community rallied around Jack and Sarah's family, organizing search efforts and memorials. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Sarah Price began to fade from the front pages of newspapers and the minds of the people in Crestwood. Yet for Jack, the pain and the need for answers never stopped. Every day felt like a weight upon him, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't accept the idea that Sarah, the woman he loved and who knew the wilderness better than anyone, had simply vanished into it, swallowed up by the untamed land she had so often explored. Jack could still remember the look on her face as she kissed him goodbye that morning at the trailhead. It had been a simple, routine goodbye. Nothing about that morning had suggested that it would be the last time he would see her alive. For Jack, that goodbye haunted him, gnawed at his insides. He couldn't shake the thought that something terrible had happened to her out there, something far worse than just an accidental fall or a wild animal attack. She was too careful, too experienced for that. Something was off, and Jack wasn't about to let it slip away. Even as the authorities pulled back from the search, Jack pressed on. He went over the search area time and time again, following the routes Sarah had taken, retracing every step, hoping that something would show itself. His grief turned into obsession. It wasn't healthy, but Jack didn't care. As far as he was concerned, it was his duty to find her. At first, the park rangers had organized search parties that included trained dogs, search and rescue teams, and helicopters that scoured the mountains and valleys for any sign of Sarah. They had combed through the known trails and then expanded into the more remote sections of the forest. Jack joined these efforts, always staying at the front, scanning every tree, every ridge, every shadow that loomed in the distance. For days, nothing. Then, on the fifth day, something promising emerged. A park ranger named Carla Anderson, an experienced search and rescue expert, thought she had spotted something odd in a clearing near the top of a ridge, some 2 miles from where Sarah's car had been parked. It was a footprint, freshly imprinted in the soft soil, one that didn't belong to a hiker or animal. It was small, too small to be Sarah's, but it didn't match any of the known wildlife tracks. The shape suggested a boot print, but it didn't match any of the standard hiking boots Sarah typically wore. It was a lead, however small, and it raised hope. The search intensified around this new clue. Rangers, search dogs, and volunteers returned to the clearing, combing through the area for hours. The excitement was palpable. They thought they had something real this time, something that would lead them to Sarah. But after hours of searching, it was clear that the print was old. In fact, it had likely been there for weeks, too long to be of any use. The footprint was from someone who had been in the area long before Sarah had vanished. The small shred of hope that had risen from the discovery fell away, and the search became increasingly disheartening. Time and time again, they would find items that seemed to suggest progress. A torn piece of cloth caught on a branch, a faint trail leading into thick brush, but each lead turned out to be either unrelated or inconclusive. Days turned into weeks, and with every passing hour, the chances of finding Sarah alive dwindled. The public search was called off after 2 months, and the case began to go cold. For Jack, though, this wasn't enough. He refused to stop looking for her. He couldn't. It was impossible to let go of someone he loved, someone who had just vanished without a trace. He had to believe that she was out there, somewhere. Over the next several months, Jack continued his search alone. He would hike the same trails where they had looked for her before, visiting each and every clearing. He became something of a fixture in the park, his face drawn, hollow from sleepless nights. He spoke to the other rangers, asking them about their findings. He talked to the volunteers, hoping they had seen something he hadn't. Sometimes, when he was alone, he would sit in the clearing where she had last been, hoping for some sign, anything. He couldn't shake the thought that the answer was right there, hidden somewhere beneath the trees. It was during one of these solitary hikes, almost a year after Sarah's disappearance, when Jack came across something that made his heart skip. It was a backpack, wedged between 2 boulders in a narrow ravine that Sarah had been known to frequent. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the bag immediately. It was hers. His hands trembled as he approached it. The fabric was torn in places, as if it had been dragged through the underbrush. He unzipped it cautiously, praying that she had somehow left it behind before running for help. Inside, there were only a few items: a water bottle, a half-used notebook, and a broken compass. It was all there was. The discovery should have felt like a breakthrough, but instead, it felt like a cruel joke. The backpack didn't give Jack any new answers. It didn't tell him what happened or why Sarah had left it behind. It didn't explain where she had gone or why she had disappeared. The only thing it did was deepen the mystery. Jack was left alone with more questions than before. What had happened to Sarah? Why had she left the backpack behind? Where was she now? Days passed, and the search slowed to a crawl. The authorities moved on to other cases. The town of Crestwood, though still supportive, began to turn their attention to other things. Sarah's disappearance had become one of those tragedies that everyone talked about for a while, but then gradually forgot. Life, as it often does, continued. Jack, however, never gave up. Every weekend, he would return to the park. Every Sunday, he would be there at the trailhead, staring at the path that Sarah had walked just months ago. Then one day, as Jack was retracing the same route yet again, something unexpected happened. A retired hiker named Walter, who had hiked these same trails for decades, found something in the woods, something that would alter everything. Walter, who had heard of Sarah's disappearance but didn't know the details, was out hiking alone when he noticed something strange sticking out from under a pile of dry leaves. A small compass, engraved with a name, Sarah Price. Walter didn't know it at the time, but this discovery, one made by sheer chance, would soon bring new hope to the case that had long since gone cold. It had been a year since Sarah's disappearance, and the case had grown colder with each passing month. The search efforts had dwindled to a few dedicated volunteers who still kept her memory alive, but even their hope was fading. The authorities had all but given up. The official report had marked the case as unsolved, and the file had been placed in storage, gathering dust. For the people of Crestwood, Sarah Price was becoming a distant memory, a tragic story of a woman lost to the wilds, swallowed by the vastness of the Cascade Mountains. But for Jack, The disappearance of his girlfriend was an open wound, a question without answer. He couldn't move on. He couldn't simply forget. Every waking moment was consumed with thoughts of Sarah, thoughts of where she could be, thoughts of what had happened to her. He replayed their last conversation over and over in his mind, trying to find some clue he had missed, something, anything, that would explain her sudden absence. He even went as far as to walk through the wilderness, retracing Sarah's steps again and again, hoping to find something new, something that would lead him to her. He never gave up, but the more time passed, the more people around him seemed to. Life in Crestwood went on. The town had moved forward. Jack's obsession became a point of concern for his family and friends. They begged him to let go, to try and find peace. But he couldn't. How could he? He had promised to protect Sarah, to love her through everything, and he was failing her now by not continuing to search. As much as Jack tried to remain positive, he couldn't ignore the slow, inevitable slide into despair. The days blended together, and with each passing one, it felt as if the walls of hopelessness were closing in tighter around him. He could no longer tell whether he was simply going through the motions, or whether he still believed that Sarah would be found. A few months after the backpack was discovered, Jack received a letter. It was from a local woman, a retiree who had once been close friends with Sarah's mother. The letter was short but to the point. "I've heard about the search. I know you're still looking for Sarah. I want to help. I may have seen something unusual." The letter came as a surprise. Jack hadn't expected anyone to still be thinking about Sarah, let alone someone who might have information. Desperate for any lead, Jack reached out to the woman, whose name was Violet Thompson. Violet, now in her early 60s, was a retired teacher who had spent her life in Crestwood. She knew the woods like the back of her hand. A strong, independent woman, Violet had always been involved in the community, but had kept to herself in recent years. She didn't elaborate much in her letter, but she promised to meet Jack at a local cafe in town. When Jack arrived, Violet was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. She looked older than Jack remembered, but her eyes still sparkled with the same kind of curiosity he had always admired in her. She gestured for him to sit. "I'm glad you came," Violet said. "I've been meaning to talk to someone about this, but, well, I didn't think anyone would listen. Not after all this time." She took a deep breath before continuing. "A few weeks ago, I was out for my daily walk on the old trail near Osprey Ridge. It's a quiet place. Not many people venture there anymore. I was walking through the underbrush when I came across something odd. A pile of leaves and branches covering something that didn't belong." Jack leaned in, heart racing. "What did you find?" Violet hesitated for a moment, glancing out the window. "A piece of fabric," she said finally. "It was torn, and it had blood on it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me stop and wonder. I didn't think it had anything to do with Sarah at first. I didn't want to get my hopes up, but something about it felt off." Jack's breath caught. "Where did you find it?" "About a mile from the old campsite where Sarah was last seen. I didn't know what to do with it at the time. I took it home, washed it, and tried to forget about it. But it kept nagging at me, like something I needed to do. It wasn't until I saw your face on the news last week, still looking for answers, that I decided to come forward." Violet reached into her bag and pulled out a small, plastic evidence bag. Inside was the fabric, a scrap of cloth with jagged edges, faded but still stained with something that looked like dried blood. Jack took the bag in his hands, his heart pounding. This was it. This could be the break they needed. "I think you should take it to the police," Violet said softly. "Let them test it. It may not be much, but it could lead somewhere. It could finally give you the answer you've been looking for." Jack felt a mix of excitement and dread. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had waited so long for even the smallest piece of evidence, and now it was in his hands. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope, faint but undeniable. He left the cafe, the fabric clutched tightly in his hand. The following day, Jack took the evidence to the local sheriff's office. He knew the chances of this small scrap of fabric leading to anything concrete were slim, but he also knew that every little piece of the puzzle mattered. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Doug Williams, agreed to send the fabric off for testing. "We'll see what we can find," Doug said, but there was a clear doubt in his voice. Jack didn't let that deter him. Even the smallest lead was a step closer to finding Sarah. The next few days were agonizing, the waiting interminable. Jack couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything other than the hope that this scrap of fabric would finally unravel the mystery. And then, 2 weeks later, the call came. The fabric had tested positive for blood, human blood. The blood matched Sarah Price's DNA. That revelation sent shockwaves through Jack. It was the first definitive proof he had that Sarah had been hurt, that something had happened to her. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to open the case back up. The sheriff immediately ordered another search, this time with a narrower focus, concentrated around the area where the fabric had been found. New hope surged within Jack, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were finally getting somewhere. But as the search efforts picked up, something else was discovered, something far darker, more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. The discovery of Sarah's blood on the fabric was enough to reignite the investigation, but it was only the beginning. The searchers, guided by new evidence, returned to the area near Osprey Ridge with renewed determination. Jack was there, of course, despite the danger, despite the exhaustion. His legs burned with the strain, but he kept going, driven by the small spark of hope that had been rekindled. For the first time in months, Jack allowed himself to believe that there was still a chance, a real chance, that Sarah might still be out there somewhere. It wasn't long before the search teams found something else. Deep in the thick underbrush, where the trees grew close together and the ground was uneven, the rangers stumbled upon a disturbing sight. It was a shallow grave, hastily dug and poorly concealed, but still unmistakable. The earth had been disturbed. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves as the rangers carefully uncovered the grave. At first, there was nothing, just more soil, more roots, and mud. But then, the glint of something metallic caught the light. It was a bracelet, a simple silver one with a small engraved heart. Jack's heart stopped. It was Sarah's bracelet. He recognized it immediately. The discovery sent shockwaves through the team. The grave was examined with the utmost care, but all they found at first were Sarah's personal items. The bracelet, a single shoe, and a few strands of her hair caught in the roots of the surrounding trees. The rest of her body, was nowhere to be found. It was clear that whoever had buried her had either moved her or left the grave undisturbed. For Jack, the discovery felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah had been hurt, that much was certain. The blood, the bracelet, and the grave all confirmed the same horrifying truth. She hadn't just gone missing. Something had happened to her. Something violent. The authorities immediately called in forensic experts to search the grave more thoroughly. The area was combed inch by inch. They found traces of blood in the soil, and beneath it, the faintest signs of a struggle. It was clear now that Sarah hadn't disappeared willingly. Someone had taken her. Jack's heart ached with each passing hour as the investigators worked. Every moment seemed to stretch on forever, filled with unanswered questions. Who could have done this? And why? What had happened to Sarah in those final moments? The more they uncovered, the more questions piled up, until Jack felt like he was drowning in them. The forensic team took the bracelet, along with the blood samples from the grave, back to the lab for further testing. They ran DNA analysis, looking for any possible match, any link to the perpetrator. 4 days, Jack waited. It felt like the longest week of his life. But finally, the breakthrough came, a partial DNA match. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was enough to begin narrowing down the list of suspects. The match led to someone Jack had never considered, a man named Tom Riley. Tom was a local handyman, a quiet man in his 40s, who had worked in Crestwood for years, doing odd jobs for various homeowners, including some of the families in the area. He had no criminal record and had always been considered a loner, someone who kept to himself. But the DNA matched his, and that was all the authorities needed to start their investigation. Tom had worked on the Price family's house a few times over the years. He had done some minor repairs, fixed plumbing, and even helped with the landscaping. He wasn't a frequent visitor, but he had known the family for a long time. The fact that his DNA was found at the scene of Sarah's disappearance immediately raised suspicions. The authorities dug deeper into his past, looking for any signs of motive or criminal activity. What they found was unsettling. Tom Riley had a history of inappropriate behavior, though nothing that had ever been fully investigated or proven. He had a habit of showing up uninvited at people's homes, particularly women's homes. He had a pattern of obsession, of becoming fixated on people, and then disappearing for long stretches of time. It seemed that Tom had been stalking Sarah in the months leading up to her disappearance. Investigators found evidence of his obsession with her, including photographs of Sarah taken without her knowledge. They found a series of handwritten notes he had written about her, all describing her in unnerving detail. In one of the notes, he had even written, "I know her better than anyone else. She belongs with me." The detectives quickly realized that Tom Riley wasn't just some random suspect. He had been watching Sarah. He had been planning something for a long time. And now, the time had come for him to face the consequences. The investigation quickly escalated. Surveillance teams were set up to monitor Tom's movements. For several days, they tracked his every step, watching him from a distance, but he never made a move. He was careful. He was quiet. Too quiet. Then, 2 weeks later, the break came. One of the surveillance teams managed to get a clear shot of Tom leaving his house late one night. He had a bag with him, something heavy that clinked with the sound of metal. The police moved in quickly, surrounding his house, preparing for a confrontation. They had enough to arrest him now, but they didn't know where Sarah's body was. They needed more answers. The arrest happened without incident. Tom Riley was taken into custody without a fight, his face blank, unreadable. But there was no sign of the remorse one would expect from a man facing such serious charges. He was eerily calm, almost detached, as if he knew exactly what was coming. The interrogation room was where everything would unravel. As the detectives sat across from him, they pressed him for answers. They showed him the photographs, the notes, the evidence. They told him about the blood, the grave, and the bracelet. And still, he said nothing. Then, after hours of questioning, Tom finally spoke. His voice was cold, emotionless. "I didn't mean to kill her," he said, his eyes vacant. "I just wanted her to stay with me." She didn't understand. She never understood. Tom's confession was chilling. It wasn't remorseful. It wasn't apologetic. It was simply a detached explanation, as though he had been justified in his actions. He confessed to abducting Sarah, to keeping her captive in his cabin for several days before something went terribly wrong. He claimed that he had tried to control her, to make her see things his way, but Sarah had fought back. She had tried to escape. In the end, Tom said, Sarah had tried to run, and that's when he had lost control. In the woods, near the old campsite, he had attacked her, hitting her with a blunt object before dragging her body to the spot where she was buried. But that was all he would say. He wouldn't reveal the exact location of Sarah's body. He kept that information to himself, holding it back like a cruel game. The days following Tom Riley's arrest were a blur of activity. Investigators scoured every inch of his cabin, the woods near Osprey Ridge, and the small corners of Crestwood where Tom had once worked. Every place was filled with new revelations, each more unsettling than the last. Tom's confession had been horrifying, but it hadn't provided the full closure that everyone hoped for. He had admitted to the crime, but he hadn't revealed the final truth, where Sarah's body lay. The authorities had no choice but to keep searching. They tried everything they could to force him to speak, bringing in specialists, interrogating him from every angle. But Tom was a master of evasion. His answers were always vague, and his demeanor was calm, almost too calm, like someone who had already resigned himself to his fate. The investigation, despite being initially electrified by the discovery, had plateaued. Every lead seemed to hit a wall. It was as though Tom was toying with them, withholding information for reasons they couldn't understand. The months dragged on, and the frustration among the investigators grew. Sarah's family, too, was feeling the pressure. Jack, still obsessively searching for his girlfriend's body, became increasingly desperate. He spent hours with the investigators, sifting through evidence, and even joined the search parties again, despite his exhaustion. But no matter how hard they searched, Sarah was still nowhere to be found. Then, one afternoon, a break came, and it came from an unexpected source. A forensic analyst named Emily Harris, who had been working tirelessly on Sarah's case, reviewed Tom's confession and the evidence once again. She had been examining the blood found in the grave, as well as the blood on the fabric that Violet Thompson had found, and there was something in the samples that bothered her. There was a second DNA trace present in the blood, something that didn't match Sarah or Tom. Emily made an immediate call to the lead investigator, Detective Peter Matthews, to inform him of her findings. "This changes everything," Emily said when Matthews arrived at the lab. "The blood we found at the scene, the blood on Sarah's bracelet and in the grave, it's not just Sarah's. There's a second person's blood mixed in." Matthews was stunned. "A second person? So someone else was involved?" Emily nodded. "Exactly. Whoever it was, they were there. They had contact with Sarah, and possibly with Tom, too. This could be the break we've been waiting for." The news sent waves of shock through the team. It didn't make sense. If Tom had been alone with Sarah, how was there another person's blood? How had they missed this crucial detail before? It meant that Tom hadn't been working alone. Someone else had been involved in the abduction and possibly even the murder. They needed to find out who. The investigators returned to Tom, hoping that this new development would finally force him to speak. But as expected, Tom remained silent, even when they confronted him with the news. He refused to cooperate. His mind was already made up, his guilt clear, but he was holding on to the final piece of the puzzle. He was playing a game, a dangerous game, one that was getting under the skin of everyone involved. The authorities decided to take a different approach. They began looking into Tom's associates, his past, and his acquaintances in the town. They knew that someone must have helped him, or at least had knowledge of the crime. They found one person in particular, a man named Mark Trent, a former co-worker of Tom's, who had been a part of the local construction crew. Mark had a history of petty crime, but he was also a well-known figure in Crestwood, having been involved in a series of minor altercations over the years. When they tracked him down, he seemed nervous, agitated, and eager to avoid the spotlight. The investigators sat down with him and began to press him for answers. At first, Mark denied knowing anything about Sarah's disappearance, but the detectives pushed harder, presenting him with the evidence: the blood, the DNA match, and the connection to Tom. They even showed him surveillance footage of Tom leaving his house the night Sarah disappeared, the heavy bag in his hands. Mark's story started to unravel. Finally, Mark broke down. His confession was almost as chilling as Tom's. Mark had been a regular visitor at Tom's cabin. They had known each other for years, having worked together on various jobs around Crestwood. But what Mark revealed was far darker than anyone could have anticipated. "I didn't think it would go that far," Mark said, his voice trembling. "Tom, he wasn't right in the head. He'd always talk about Sarah, about how perfect she was, how she was the one. But she never looked at him that way. She was with Jack. It drove him crazy. He started following her, talking about how he could make her see the truth. He said he'd keep her with him forever." Mark paused, his eyes darting to the ground. It was supposed to be simple, just a way to scare her, maybe hold her for a bit, then let her go. But then things got out of hand. When Sarah tried to run Tom didn't want to let her go. And that's when I knew we were in too deep. Mark confessed to being the second person at the scene. He had helped Tom carry Sarah to the grave, though he denied any direct involvement in the attack. He claimed he didn't know what had happened until it was too late. He said that Tom had begged him for help, that Tom had been afraid of getting caught. Mark agreed to bury Sarah's belongings, but insisted that he didn't know what had happened to her body after that. Despite his partial confession, there was still no sign of Sarah. But the revelation of a second person's involvement changed everything. It was clear now that Tom's actions weren't the result of some isolated obsession. There was a network of support, someone who had enabled his crimes and helped cover them up. The discovery of Mark Trent's involvement in Sarah's disappearance set off a chain reaction of events that neither the police nor the town of Crestwood were prepared for. As the investigation moved into its final stages, tensions ran high. The public now knew that Sarah had not been the victim of a single, solitary perpetrator, but of a twisted conspiracy involving two men who had worked together, each feeding the other's dangerous obsession. But even as the authorities closed in on the final pieces of the puzzle, the one thing they had yet to resolve still hung heavily over the case: Sarah's body. In the days following Mark's confession, the search efforts resumed with renewed vigor. The authorities, backed by forensic experts and the police, combed through the forested areas surrounding Osprey Ridge. They returned to the grave that had been discovered earlier, but there was nothing. They scoured nearby caves, even revisiting the small cabins and outbuildings Tom had worked on over the years. Nothing. Then, the breakthrough came unexpectedly. It was Jack, still reeling from the emotional turmoil, who suggested they search the old rock quarry just outside of town. The quarry had been abandoned for years, the tall trees growing wild around it. Jack had always avoided it. There was something eerie about the place, but something about it tugged at him now. Maybe it was the thought of Sarah being so close, hidden beneath layers of time and earth. Maybe it was the fact that it seemed like the last place anyone would look. As the search teams moved in, Jack's heart beat faster, his breath shallow. He watched as they combed the quarry, turning over rocks and shifting through the long grass. Hours passed with no sign of Sarah's body. It felt as though they were chasing ghosts. And yet, they kept going. Finally, just as the sun began to set, one of the investigators, a young officer named Emily, called out. "I think I found something," she shouted, her voice trembling with urgency. Jack rushed her aside, his pulse quickening with a mixture of fear and hope. He saw Emily kneeling down, carefully pulling back a thick layer of moss from a rocky outcrop. Beneath it, buried in the dirt, was a set of bones, partially exposed but unmistakable. It was a body, and the bones were human. They called in forensic specialists immediately. As the team worked tirelessly to unearth the remains, Jack stood a few feet away, staring at the scene with a mixture of dread and sorrow. This was it. They had found Sarah, or at least they hoped they had. The worst part of the search was always the waiting, the uncertainty of not knowing. But now the waiting had ended. The forensic team carefully excavated the remains, revealing that they belonged to a woman. Sarah. The bracelet, the one Sarah had worn every day, was found buried alongside her, still intact. The forensic pathologist who examined the remains confirmed that Sarah had been buried there for a long time, a victim of blunt force trauma. The same injuries Tom had confessed to inflicting. It didn't bring Sarah back, but at least it brought answers. At least the family could have closure. The next few days were a blur for Jack. The small town of Crestwood, which had once been a sleepy place where nothing ever seemed to happen, was now the site of a tragic end. The discovery of Sarah's body sent waves of shock through the community. People who had never known Sarah, people who had barely noticed her while she was alive, now mourned her loss in the same way they mourned for their own loved ones. Tom and Mark both faced charges of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, their trial set to begin in the months following the discovery. But even with their capture, the pain remained for the family. Jack, in particular, was never the same. He became a quiet man, withdrawn and distant, his grief etched on every line of his face. He attended the trial, watched as both men were convicted, and even sat through the sentencing. But nothing in that courtroom could undo the damage that had been done. Sarah's family and friends worked to honor her memory. They established a scholarship fund in her name, aimed at helping local students pursue higher education. It was a small consolation, but it was something. It kept Sarah's spirit alive in a world that had tried to forget her. At the same time, they held memorials, not only to mourn her, but to remind themselves that they were still a family, still bound by love, despite the tragedy that had torn their lives apart. The town of Crestwood, too, was forever changed. The quiet streets were no longer as peaceful as they once were. People looked over their shoulders, wondering if anyone they knew was hiding a dark secret. A sense of unease lingered in the air. But slowly, the town began to heal. New safety measures were put in place, with community programs designed to raise awareness about the dangers of stalking and obsessive behavior. One night, long after the investigation had ended, Jack stood alone on the bluff near Osprey Ridge, looking out over the forest. He had come here many times with Sarah. They had hiked together, shared quiet moments in the shadow of the trees. It was her favorite place, her sanctuary. As he stood there, Jack let the cool evening air wash over him, feeling a strange peace settle within him. He wasn't sure if he would ever find peace completely, but for the first time in months, he felt Sarah's presence with him. He closed his eyes, letting the memories flood in, Her laughter, the way she always found the best flowers on their hikes, her love of the outdoors, her joy in life. For the first time since her death, Jack smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but it was a smile of acknowledgement. Sarah was gone, but she wasn't forgotten. Not by him. Not by anyone who loved her. The wind rustled through the trees as Jack stood there, knowing that the forest would always hold a part of Sarah. And that, perhaps, was enough.